Hi everyone, welcome to the Gamasutra Twitch channel. My name is Bryant Francis. If you can see me right now, this is a rare occasion where I actually get to be on camera. I am super pumped for today's show because I have been working really hard to get this thing together, and we're going to be looking at a game that has captured my heart these last few months. This is the X-Wing Miniatures board game. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is a game from Fantasy Flight Games, and I'm joined today by four wonderful faces who are all kind of up here-ish, and one over here. Alex Waro, could you quickly introduce yourself, remind people who you are?
Hi. My name is Alex. I'm an editor at Gamasutra.com, and I will try to be quiet during this entire conversation because A, I've only played one match of X-Wing, and B, there is another more interesting Alex on the call. Alex, who are you, and what do you do on X-Wing?
I'm one of the developers on the game. Frank and I have been working on it the longest of the people gathered here today. He beats me by like a month, something like that. For almost
4 years?
4 years now. 4 years of plastic spaceships. 4 glorious years of white hot space combat.
Frank and Max, can you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Sure, I'll go first. I'm Max Brook. I've been at Fantasy Flight the longest by a very narrow margin, but I spent a lot of that time working on role-playing games, and I've been on X-Wing for coming up on 2 years now. Started in Wave 9, and I'm also a developer.
Cool. To get things started, I'm going to quickly go over what we are here to talk about today. I was just wanting to get a chance to pick your guys' brains about what it's like making new ships for this game, because yesterday these 3 ships right here hit stores, and each of them is a new ship for one of the game's 3 factions. Since the only ship that viewers will probably recognize from any other Star Wars media is the X-Wing, hanging out here in the background, I'm just going to quickly... this is the Scourge H6 bomber for the Scum and Villainy factions. This is the TIE Aggressor for the Empire, and this is the I actually can't pronounce this. Azutuk gunship for the Rebels.
New one.
It is a Wookiee gunship meant to just be stuff full of Wookiees doing Wookiee things. For those of you who don't know anything about the way this game works, basically you start off by taking maneuver dials like this. I'm going to bring it on camera here. You pick a maneuver. In this case, we are going to make it just one straight because the aggressor does not have a 1 turn, which made me fly him off the board the other night. So you would pick that maneuver, hide the dial, and then when it came time to move the ships after you've picked them, you proceed to then just use these little maneuver templates, which come with the core game, to move them forward that maneuver. Forgive my poor etiquette here with moving it. You would be obviously a lot more refined than that. But after that, once then ships can take actions, ships can begin combat. So I guess my first question for our 3 guests here, now that we've gotten to just take a quick peek at the new ships, is what kind of design challenges were you looking to solve by introducing each of these ships to their factions?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on with these ships, obviously. The most obvious one, which I'll just take right away, is that the Empire did not have any access to the turret slot. The TIE Aggressor was a ship we'd considered before, but hadn't really had a good opportunity to do, and we decided to, take the plunge, give the Empire a turret, and see what happens. And we feel really good about it, actually. At least I do. I don't know about these two, but it's a pretty straightforward ship. But the 2 missile slots and the turret make it pretty interesting. It's got enough going on that you can do some pretty cool stuff with it you couldn't do in the faction before. It gives the Empire access to a nice flanker, which is kind of fun. It just plays a little differently than some of their previous things. I'm going to let one of these two talk about the Scourge, because they'd wanted to do that for ages. And I remember for several waves, I remember having conversations with Alex about how much we wanted to make that happen, and then there's something else would come up,
Do you want to take it, Alex?
Yeah, sure. No, the Scourge got sidelined for a long time, and I like the ship. I think it it brings something new to the Scum and Villainy faction. They didn't really have a heavy bomber sort of workhorse gunship prior to this wave. And with every new ship that we add to the game, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to keep what is just a fantastic, fun, competitive game alive. We're trying to inject new life into it. We're trying to open up new strategies, get the player base excited for how these cards, ships, upgrades, all of it will come together and influence their play style and what it'll do for their list building opportunities. And I think the Skurg is just kind of packed full of goodness in that respect. It's got Cad Bane, the Clone Wars fan favorite bounty hunter character, adds a lot of bombing potential. It has a bunch of new upgrades that kind of let you seed the playfield with mines before the game even begins, which not only makes the Skurg an interesting proposition, but also adds some pretty interesting strategies to existing bombers. The TIE Punisher for the Empire can actually benefit from the minefield mappers. So it's one of those kind of Swiss Army ships, and it's one of those expansions that we got to kind of stretch our wings a little bit and design some pretty goofy but also effective, interesting mechanics for. So I think that's going to add a lot of fun strategies for players.
Yeah, we're going to build on the Skurg for just a second. Tbets94 in the chat would like to know why unlimited bombs. Just for reference, I'm going to drop from in front of here the bomblet card that comes. He's specifically referencing about. So this, for those at home, this card specifically allows ships that equip it, but the only ships that can equip it, they need to have 2 of the bomb slots that you see at the bottom left-hand corner of the card. This lets them drop a continuous stream of bombs with every motion, and those little bomb tokens, I'll dig it out of my little pile right here. Or I'll dig it out of my little pile. They are in here, aren't they? Uh-oh.
They call customer service if they're not.
Yeah.
They're pretty good about replacement cards. I will say that.
Oh, sweet. I might need a new asteroid. Yeah, they look like this. Found it. Yeah, so these little things go off when they go off with units within range 1 of them have to roll 2 attack dice to decide if they'll get hit. So that would have been 2 hits right there. So yeah, what's up with the infinite bombs? Because usually ships only have a limited number when they go in.
Well, this is one of those funny cases of games building on games. Mm-hmm. So the Skurg comes to us courtesy Jedi Starfighter, a game some people probably remember. And one of its mechanics in that game was this bomblet generator, which was able to, in the video game, generate, an infinite number of bombs. The idea being it's sort of this, it draws power from the engine to create these little, explosions that go off behind the ship. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to play with that mechanic because we thought it was pretty cool, too. So it was an interesting card. It went through a bunch of crazy iterations. We tried some things where we tried to thematically have it draw power from the engine. Maybe you had to... maybe it gave you stress or something. But we eventually kind of found that having infinite, not that great bombs, still pretty hard to use effectively. Requires a lot of player skill, and there's a lot you can do to play around it, and it's interesting. But it didn't prove to be as powerful as it sounds like it should be on paper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, back in
things in this expansion that kind of pushed the limits a little bit. Actually. One of the things that's always interesting when you're designing something is one of the things we sometimes like to do is just, start the conversation with our playtesters at its most ridiculous level, just to see, how we have to pull it back to make it balanced within the game. How do we, do we pull it back from the edge if it's too good? But every once in a while, we'll try something that we think is crazy, and in practice, it turns out to be fairly well balanced. I think the minefield mapper is another good example of that. You can put as many mines on the table as you can squeeze into a list, and it ends up being a pretty preposterous number. But it's not really a super viable strategy. So it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, why not? Why not infinity bombs? It doesn't feel oppressive. It doesn't feel too dominant, and it fits with the theme. And we're always trying to be just a little bit simulationist. So, it just ended up kind of working as as intended without needing a lot of qualification.
What do you mean by simulationist? Because we usually speak to video game developers. We have talks about like being formalist and that kind of thing, but I don't think that's something we typically hear. So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I think, it's not going to be, it's not going to put you into the cockpit of an X-Wing. It's not going to feel like, you're in the Death Star trench, but we have to kind of, as designers, acknowledge where these ships come from, like what the source material is. And particularly with a property like Star Wars, that's a huge part of why people love the game. And if we can make a ship that's fun to fly, that adds a new dimension to a player's strategy, and also feels like it's Star Wars, and specifically it feels like the ship that it is from Star Wars, we like to do that. So because in Jedi Starfighter, Nim could drop these infinite bombs, because this bomblet generator existed. Maybe it only showed up in a video game for 5 seconds, but if we can draw on that for inspiration, I think it makes the product a lot richer. It makes it feel like we're paying attention to where it came from. So are we, strapping on VR headsets and simulating X-Wing combat? No, but if we can get close to the original material, I think that is it's a good thing for fans, and it's a fun thing for us as a jumping off point for design.
And to step back a little bit, the whole paradigm of simulationist, there's sort of this in role playing. There's this ongoing conversation about simulationism, gamism, and what is it? Simulationism, gamism.
I'm gonna give you time with this because I want to know.
Yeah, I'm like, wait, this is really good.
What else could there be?
Simulationism, gamism, narrativism, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
So basically, it's like, how much is your role-playing game driven by a desire to simulate reality, which these days has shifted much more to be a conversation about verisimilitude rather than reality. Mm-hmm. Back in the old days of role-playing games, there were a lot of games that had 1 billion tables to roll on to try to simulate, gravity in a realistic manner, and that's sort of
charts on charts.
Yep, the old Rollmaster and such, and that's sort of been walked back. So that conversation is usually more about verisimilitude, sort of like not reality, but feeling like reality. Mm-hmm. And then there's gamism, which is being a fun game, and then there's narrativism, which is the story element. Minis games have a little less of the narrativism, though it definitely still plays there. That's being able to sort of have those movie moments. And simulations is interesting too, because in a minis game, you're not usually trying to simulate reality so much as a movie. You're trying to get that I don't care if it feels. In fact, I don't want it to feel like reality, because in Star Wars, spaceships don't move like they do in reality, and the movement templates are a good example of that. Like, they move like an airplane, but that's how Star Wars ships move. So you kind of want to balance those ideas, and that's a whole other set of conversations. But it's just an interesting thing to dip into briefly, and it's something we think and talk a lot about. Is like, how much do we want to push like faithfulness to the source material versus like mechanics, and ideally, how do we marry those and really get both?
Yeah, I think another good example of this was when we got the fortunate opportunity to work on the Shadowcaster from Star Wars Rebels. Mm-hmm. The ship what's her name again?
Ketsu.
Oh, different pilot.
Yeah.
Has basically, in her ship there is a gun on the top that she can control from the cockpit. So in the game, in the show, they told us how it was going to be shown in the episodes. We hadn't even seen the episode yet, but we were explained how, she can control it from the cockpit, and it was this elaborate system and everything. And basically, it didn't behave like a turret in the normal sense, because in Star Wars we have a lot of armed turrets, like the Falcon, of course, where there's Luke sitting in there shooting away. But in this instance, it was her in the cockpit controlling this other gun,
while also flying the ship.
So in order to try to capture how that would work in the game, we felt like this was a good opportunity for us to make a new mechanic, which we did with the mobile firing arc, where you could basically choose where the gun was going to shoot before you went. So rather than just being like, it's my turn to attack, I'll just attack, where you'd have to kind of plan a couple turns in advance. So it actually added some interesting new playstyle that was not in the game at that point, where we really made turrets play the game, trying to keep ships in your arc, whether it's your front arc or the arc you chose. It kind of makes the ship play like we see it would behave from the show. So this was an example where we kind of simulated the experience of what it would be like to control a gun while also flying a plane, rather than just letting it be abstracted with a primary turret like we already had.
Right on. I have some questions I want to dig into, but Brian, I see we have some in chat. Was there something you wanted to get to specifically?
Yeah, let's jump into chat. We're gonna move a little bit away from the design questions for a second, into one question about sort of the tournament scene that exists for this game. Bellamont would like to know, with the amount of ships now available, is it time to make the 2-list format standard for tournaments? With 2 lists, players will have a chance to counter some of the more meta builds. To explain that for folks at home, usually you show up to a tournament and the tournament rule is 100 points, death matches. So you build one list that is 100 points worth of ships and upgrades. This player is proposing that players be allowed to make 2 lists based on that. Have you guys thought about that?
I think it's
a little.
Oh, go for it.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, to give you a little bit of background on that, there's a series of events that we do every year that we started doing last year, and it's called the System Open series.
Yeah.
And we do these things called hangar bays, and they're pretty cool. They're variations on a theme. They're a different way to play X-Wing. Generally, they have list building restrictions, and I think one of the ones that was really popular was this 2-list format where you would bring 2, and there was a mechanism for which lists you would be able to play and that sort of thing. And it was really popular, and it's a lot of fun. As for whether we would want to introduce that into standard play, all I can really say is sure, it's a possibility. It's one of those things that you have to balance a lot of different factors. The tournament scene as it exists now is the product of a lot of conversations, a lot of trial and error. We've gone through several different ranking systems, and draws were briefly a rule, and before that there was the first system we did had partially destroyed ships, and so it's kind of gone through a lot of revision to get to the state that it's in now. But we're always looking to improve stuff. Requiring 2 lists, of course, is a higher buy-in for newer players, so that's a concern. But we're certainly happy that people are having fun with the 2-list format, and we certainly wouldn't want to rule anything out for future competitive play. So it's an interesting suggestion. It's certainly worth having further discussion about.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and our organized play team is always thinking about this stuff too. It's another thing to just underscore is we certainly talk plenty about this, but at the end of the day, it's organized play's call because they run the tournaments. They listen to us and we listen to them. And we try to really be open and communicative, and it works well. But that's their call. But we have certainly discussed ideas like that with them.
Nice. When I talk to people who work primarily, I don't know if any have worked in video game design yet or have goals to in the future, but when I talk to people who mostly work in that field, they recommend board games as things to both play, enjoy, and study because they're so not I want to say obvious or simple, but like they're very to play a board game, you have to know how everything works. There's nothing to do the work for you, right? Like in a video game, you have the computer to do all the calculations and keep track of the rules, but a board game has to be like boiled down to a very like pristine, ideal format. And I know that makes it sometimes tricky to sort of convey abstract concepts in a way that like is conducive to fast play. When I was playing this with Brian, like I guess 6 months ago now, I was surprised at how effectively it abstracts 3D space combat down to a 2D plane. And I imagine that's not easy. So I want to know, like, what have your lessons been in your years in this project about how you can distill a very abstract idea down to a effective, good game mechanic?
Test the hell out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. But yeah, we struggle with this all the time as we are being introduced with either new things from media or new Star Wars mechanics that are introduced, and we try to simulate them as we were discussing earlier. And so sometimes you take an idea and you have to say like, well, okay, if we were to perfectly simulate it, how would you do it? And it might be like, oh, there's like 4 variables and they all interact with each other, and it's like, well, that's obviously too much work, and we don't want to add that clumsy system on top of an otherwise streamlined system.
Any idea that starts with, all right, we're going to need more than one token for this, probably is a non-starter.
Yeah. So you like work your way back, and sometimes it's good to even start from the most abstract version as well. You're like, what is the least we could do to make you feel like you're doing the thing we want you to feel? And if that's too loose, you might get a little bit closer to the simulating, because there's a nice break point, as you're saying, where you don't want the players to be spending a good percentage of the time thinking about this one mechanic. If all it takes is just a game mechanic that's something that's already present, and it's like, oh yeah, that would do that thing.
Is there a good example you could share with fellow designers? I know Bryant recently explained to me how the cloaking mechanic works, and I was super confounded for a minute until I realized, oh, well, if you have to barrel roll when you come out of cloak, because that means they won't know where you're going to be. And that took me like a couple minutes to realize, to sort of walk back the design process and see how that works and go, okay, that makes sense. So is there something else you would point to as like a good concrete example of this process in action?
Well, I think Cloak is perfect, actually, because when Frank and I were working on that, we went through at least 9 iterations of that. And it worked 9 completely radically different ways before we landed on the solution that we did. And the tricky thing about X-Wing, and one of the reasons that I think it's so much fun to work on and so much fun to play, is it has this elegant simplicity to it. At its core level, it really does, like you were saying, it boils down 3D space, and it boils down Star Wars, and it boils down dogfighting, aerial combat, tremendously well for such a simple system. And so, as designers, one thing we never want to lose sight of is that elegant simplicity, because as soon as you layer on too much complexity, as soon as you layer on too many rules, and keep in mind, this game's been going for almost 5 years now, so there's dozens of ships out there with dozens of new mechanics, and every single time we add to this layer cake, we have to try to make sure that we're not obfuscating what makes the game fundamentally so joyous to experience. So Cloak was super complicated at times. Sometimes it was too simple. And what we kept coming back to is it's truly my belief that the heart and soul of X-Wing is maneuvering your ships. That's what's so interesting. It's spinning those dials. It's trying to guess where your opponent's going to be. You can, there's a whole nother phase of the game, which is, making sure your attacks are effective, target priority, and all of that. So there's a lot of different elements, but the core of it is the maneuver phase. And once we kind of twigged on making Cloak function like a maneuver, trying to convey that temporal uncertainty of like the cloaking device, like where are you, where are you coming out of cloaking, then it sort of clicked into place. And we didn't even get it right the first time. Like I will admit that when the Phantom first came out, you were able to decloak when your ship activated. So the higher your pilot skill was, the more of the board state you got to see before you decloaked. And it was just brutal. Like, a good Phantom player could slice and dice through an enemy squad, and it was unbelievable. We had 86 points out of 100 lists winning tournaments. So it was one of those few times where a mechanic was just sort of fundamentally overpowered in the right hands. And so we had to issue an errata, dial it back, and put cloaking at the start of the combat phase instead. Or at the start of the so basically, it took a lot of work to try to convey a complex concept in pretty simple terms, but we're really happy with the final result, and I think it's a fun mechanic that is not overly difficult to grasp once you've played it with it a couple of times.
Yeah, I think it's a good example of like gamist versus simulationist, right? Because like clearly a spaceship flying through space invisible would be able to decimate an entire enemy force, but that's no fun. So,
I'm gonna. Oh, do you want to say something, Max?
I was just gonna briefly add to that I think Alex hit on a really important point in there that I just wanted to reiterate, which is that one of the things that that the target priority, the building combinations, pretty much every miniatures game has some amount of that. But I think one of the things that really makes X-Wing stand out as unique is the way the maneuver works. And so playing to that is important to development, and thinking about playing to the strengths of the platform you already have, as opposed to trying to make it into something else or something like that is a pretty key part of design. So I just wanted to hit on that briefly.
Yeah, sure.
I do want to ask a question from the chat, but I'm going to briefly toss in something that the people I play with have wondered about a lot, which is, if X-Wing is a game about maneuvering, how come there are a lot of ships and abilities that let them shoot in a 360 arc around them?
That one's back to the simulation. That's what is in Star Wars.
Star Wars.
If we could control it, we'd probably make everything just shoot in arcs, but movies have us having people gunning turrets that shoot outside of arc. But.
Yeah.
I mean, perhaps the most iconic Star Wars ship, the Millennium Falcon, has 2 quad laser turrets, one on the top and one on the bottom. And there's a good chunk of New Hope where Luke and Han sit in these, kind of World War II style laser turret seats and blast TIE fighters out of the sky. So if we didn't present that as an option for players, it just wouldn't feel like Star Wars. And I think that's sort of it's that balancing act, right? Because you're right, like a 360-degree turret ship undercuts that, maneuver, get the enemy in the firing arc gameplay that's so integral to the game. That being said, there's ways to make the game about maneuvering even if a ship can fire in 360 degrees. Because a turret ship, what it's trying to do is it's trying to get out of enemy arcs in order to leverage its advantage, which is the fact that it can shoot out of arc. But they're generally more expensive than equivalent ships, and they are generally, if not more fragile, then certainly more fragile than their points would warrant. So they're playing the game just as much as the ships with firing arcs are. It's just that they're trying to sort of make up for their more expensive chassis by leveraging that advantage, and that becomes the strategy of that match. Can the opponent of the turret ship manage to get enough shots off to mitigate that advantage? But that being said, we kind of recognize that those mechanics are in defiance of kind of the core ethos of the game, if you will. So we've done all kinds of things in recent years to reward people for having targets in arc. The newer Millennium Falcon that we released for The Force Awakens has a couple of there's a pilot crew combination. It's Rey flying the ship and Finn in the gunner position, and it gives you a bunch of rewards for having your enemy in your firing arc. So even though you're flying a turret ship, when we kind of based that off of the scene in the film where the gun gets locked in the forward position and Rey has to do a crazy maneuver in order to bring it to bear on the TIE fighters that are engaging her. And we just took that out as a really good jumping off point, because it's like, oh, hey, well, we can use that. We can sort of nod to that thematic thing, but also, tie players into the importance of a firing arc. Even though they have out-of-arc shots, the ship's going to function better if it can fire in arc. So we're always trying to reward that when possible.
A recent example of that is in this new wave, in fact, synced turret in the TIE aggressor functions that way, where you get benefits for attacking in arc, even if you can attack targets out of arc. So it's sort of playing to that, like, out of arc attacks can be a point of flexibility, but making it more optimal to try to be lining up arcs and playing like that. And when I started on the game, Alex and Frank, both said, like, abilities that reward being in arc with turret ships are really good. And I tried to take that to heart. So,
how come that card has a target lock requirement?
I liked the idea thematically that it's sort of this thing where you have to set it up. Like you have to be, like lining up this shot, in a more precise way. And it adds a really interesting gameplay restriction as well, because you have to set this thing up. Makes it a little bit more limited in utility than Twin Laser Turret, which let us make it a lot cheaper than Twin Laser Turret. One of the problems we ran into with various incarnations of it was that if they were ever... It had this difficulty where if it got too close to Twin Laser Turret in utility, it just became useless or way too good, depending on where it was priced. There was no good place to put it there, so we had to really create something that broke it out in a pretty different way. So making it play differently with your action economy, forced it to sort of behave differently, and then suddenly we could downprice it, and it's a very different choice.
Yeah.
It's also part of the reason it was originally in testing, I think for a while at least, it was range 2 to 3, and we shifted it to 1 to 2 because, again, the less it competed against twin laser turret in a direct way, the more interesting it was and the more useful things it did.
For those at home not familiar, twin laser turret is a card. I don't have it out, but it's a the ship.
It's actually in the TIE Aggressor as well, if you have it.
Yeah. Yeah. I used it on TIE Aggressor the other night. It shoots that one can only be shot at range 2 to 3. But it does let it would let a ship with equipped shoot anywhere it wanted to, as long as it was not inside the donut hole right there. Let's talk about, because Double Down has been very patient in the chat with some very good questions. Let's talk about nerfing and buffing ships. As you've said, X-Wing Miniatures has been around for 5 years, which means it's a live game. New releases, new cards like these can be considered buffs or modifications to existing ships, as well as being used on these ships, because even though TIE Aggressor has a turret slot, Sync turret can be dropped on other ships, for instance. But there are also, you do seem to have an explicit technique for buffing and nerfing ships, although I'd say the buffing seems to come more in the shipping process and the nerfing comes in the FAQ. How did you sort of arrive at that process to, like, okay, we're going to release a new version of a ship, like these Aces packs, in order to make sure that some of these ships have title cards or other things that will give them the tools they need to remain viable in a live game?
It's tough. Balancing this game is tough. You mentioned video game design earlier, and one of the things that we're extraordinarily envious of is the ability of, say, League of Legends or, Overwatch or whatever to patch stuff. Really, all competitive video games will do sometimes a weekly patch, as much as a weekly patch where they can just tweak stuff. Mm-hmm. This character is too good. We're going to turn their guns down by 5% and see what happens. We're going to make them 10% slower. We're going to take away their stun lock or whatever it happens to be. There's a lot of levers that they can pull behind the scenes, and they'll release a patch with some patch notes, and then the game will move on and they can tweak. And so we don't really have that luxury. That's one of the challenges of board games and of miniatures games that come, released with cards. It's one of the reasons that some more traditional miniatures games have various editions so that they can address things like that. The way we've tried to handle it, I think, is a balance between wanting to make as many ships in the game viable as possible and also not releasing too many errata, keeping the game relatively clean so that if you open a pack, more or less what's in that pack is going to function the way that it is printed on the card. Because we can't change that. We can't go to your house, take all your cards, and write over them with a Sharpie. It's just not a possibility. So one of the ways that we've handled that is releasing new upgrade cards, new titles for ships. So we've done, like, as you mentioned, Aces packs. That gives us a chance to reevaluate the competitiveness of that ship in the current meta game. And if it's doing just fine, we like to give it, horizontal opportunities. Like, we want to give it new possibilities that are equally viable, but we don't necessarily want to increase its power. But if it's struggling, as was the case with the A-Wing, when we did the A-Wing Aces pack, we like to give it a little boost, and we like to do it in a creative way. It sort of leads to older ships having to equip a bunch of upgrade cards to remain competitively viable, but it's a way that we can address things through the ordinary, product creation and release process, and people don't have to print out reminders for what everything does. Now, sometimes we can't do that. Sometimes we make a ship that's just way too good, or a mechanic like cloaking that's just way too good. So, we try to keep it to a minimum, but every once in a while we do that sort of hard errata where we're like, okay, sorry, this was too good. It works like this now. But we try to keep that to a bare minimum. And I think for a 5-year-old game, we've mostly succeeded. Forum users and denizens of the internet, feel free to disagree with that assessment. But I mean, it's a tricky balancing act, and it's something we're cognizant of, and we're trying to keep all these plates in spin without being too heavy-handed about how we fix perceived problems.
Yeah, another tricky part is the development cycle to actually incorporate those changes. Like Alex was saying, we could be like, oh, we want to reduce this, and next week it's done. But for example, when we were making the A-Wing expansion, it also had a B-Wing in there. And when we started working on it, it's like a year before it comes out. So when we were working on it, the B-Wing was fine. It was great. It was in its heyday. B-Wing didn't need any cards.
Top the pops.
Yeah, exactly. Giving it anything felt like we were just, giving it extra jazz it didn't need. So we wanted to do something to help the A-Wing, but we didn't need to do anything to the B-Wing. But of course, we developed that for 6 months, and then the ships and delivers, and eventually it comes out. And at that point, the B-Wing could have needed something more, but we didn't have the benefit of knowing what it's going to be like in the future. So it's really tricky working in an analog format like this.
Well, it's fascinating too because of the way the way lists propagate isn't necessarily the way like build paths might propagate in a MOBA or something, because its data isn't aggregated to the same degree. And so, like we will see interesting, strange shifts in the metagame sometimes that like don't seem to be prompted by much of anything. And there's some pretty major shifts, like the rise of the sort of the Paratani archetype, and then the sort of like the evolutions that's undergone, like haven't much been influenced by releases so much as just like people discovering new things. But it's not all. This is one just different thing from digital games, but it's not all instantaneous. You can't go on a website and see what has the highest win rate.
Yeah,
there are some people who track it, but it's not it's not the same enormous data set. And sometimes things, like slip through the cracks for a long time, and the competitive scene will discover these like weird sleeper hits late.
The K-Wing's another good example of that. Just to tack one on, one upgrade card, we came out with the Sabine Wren upgrade card, and suddenly K-Wings that had been around for a very long time and had never really dominated started using advanced slam, started using bombs, started using all of these strategies that we designed and released to essentially crickets at the time. And it just took one little nudge in power and they just exploded all over the metagame, which is just fascinating. Like it lay dormant forever and then exploded seemingly all at once. So it's interesting. You never really know what's going to come back or what's going to remain strong. And yesterday's Titan might be deemed completely obsolete by the competitive community based on just a few tiny shifts in the way the game is played. So it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, as a quick aside, one of the other games we used to make, Call of Cthulhu, it's a card game. Damon Stone, developer for it, he liked to put in these cards for these other factions, because I don't know how many factions were in that game. It was like 9 or something. There's a bunch. And there'd be some of these new factions.
A lot of that game.
There's a lot of factions. And anyway, they would add like one card here, one card here, one card here. And eventually there was a deck you could build. But it was so subtle and so slow of a rollout, it took people a while to realize, like, wait, is this actually, can I do this? And then suddenly someone would win an event with it, and like the whole game shifts. Oh, it's all about this one thing, even though almost all of the components, 80, 90% of the cards had been there for a long time. All it took was like the one thing and someone trying it. So there's a lot of lists that are like that in X-Wing right now, that there might be just one card away from being the best thing in the game.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, one of the things that video game developers do, in fact, that was the subject of a whole like formalized track of talks at this year's Game Developers Conference, is the idea that they look to board games for lessons, for inspiration. Right? I mean, they played them, they enjoyed them, but they also take like valuable learnings from the way they're designed and sold. I wonder, does it go reverse? I mean, you mentioned that you play Star Wars games for research, to like put the bomblet dropper or whatever in there, but as you're playing and maybe making games, like do you study and take anything from video games that you then apply to your work on the X-Wing miniatures game?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Like what?
We're constantly playing. I think
we had a lengthy conversation about Genji and Heroes of the Storm. happening. So
Yeah, we both really like Here's the Storm, so we play that a lot. But there's a lot of interesting, subtle stuff that I think is a valuable thing. Is just the player perception of a game mechanic might have more value than its actual perceived. The perceived value might be more important than its actual value. For example, I was coming up with some new cards recently, and I was actually running the math on how much damage, what's your expected outcome of dice results and whatnot. And it's fascinating how different ways of delivering the same numbers give the players a very different feel. So, for example, I was working on Rune Wars as well, and in Rune Wars, there's a mechanic where you'd roll extra dice and then remove some of them. And depending on whether you removed a good result or a bad result, it has a very different feel. Obviously, you can math out what the actual effect of that is, but rolling up extra dice and then taking some away, choosing the result you remove, feels like you're being expert and precise. You're like, I threw all these attacks and they're really exacting. But if you roll a whole bunch of extra dice and then remove a good result, then it feels like you're being chaotic and random and you're just kind of spittering fire everywhere. And so it's interesting how they can end up being almost mathematically the same, but the experience the player has is feels very different.
Or you loop this around to all the conversations about them changing the sounds to guns in video games and people thinking the gun has been made less effective.
Yeah, because that happens. That's all it is. They literally change the sound effect to be like, oh, gun shoots slower. It doesn't. It does the exact DPS that it used to do, but it sounds slower, so everyone's fine with it. It's crazy. So we're learning a lot of those psychological tricks of whether you draw a card or draw a chit or roll a die. Are those actually different? And they kind of, but they can mathematically be the same outcome.
So, how do you fall when you have to make those calls? I know how a lot of game designers fall. For example, I might say that there are many who would suggest that if you have to nerf something in a multiplayer game, rather than just knocking that one character down, you bring everyone up to that level, and that is a more player friendly and less negative way to balance. But when those decisions come to you on the miniatures game, how do you tackle them, and what route do you take?
We are concerned a little bit about raising the ceiling of the lower ones, just because that's a pretty obvious power creep in a way. If everything keeps getting stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger, then it sometimes, especially with our game that has how many 25. Forget how many different ships there are. There's a bunch of different ships in the game.
I think it's over 30 at this point.
Yeah, there's a lot of ships. So if you do minor buffs here and there, you're gonna leave ships behind. So that's the other thing about trying to balance this game specifically, is that because of the breadth of ships,
and because we can't deliver content to all ships at once.
Yeah, there are some ships that we can't deliver as a repaint, or it would be a long time before we get to, or things like that. It's hard to raise the bottom up because of how difficult it is to actually touch every ship.
And just practical considerations too, of we have stuff we're working on, and we have things in the pipeline, and would we love to do an E-wing ace? Sure, maybe, but there's a lot of other things that are kind of higher priority to do. So
I'm really sad because I love my E-wing, and no love for my E-wing.
Never say never.
Great, you're fine.
Corn is overpowered. I just need to fly him better and build him better. I'm going to go on a spree of questions from the chat. I have one more question I want to make sure I get in before we get out today. But our chat has been very patient and has some great questions here. HKUDP liked the comment about striving for elegant simplicity. What are some methods you have for simplifying mechanics down?
I'm not sure there's any specific method. There's no magic formula. There's no real rubric to follow.
Yeah.
But it's, board games are a tactile experience. I think that's something we haven't really talked about yet. But that's another thing that makes them so appealing, at least to me. And I think not to get too philosophical about it, but I think in the digital age that we live in, we spend a lot of time with screens. We spend a lot of time physically disconnected from the thing that we're engaging with. Video games bridge that gap a little bit because at least you've got a controller and you've got some, ergonomic input there. But a board game is great because you're face to face with someone, you're holding things, you're physically moving objects. And so when you're actually playing the game, when you're doing playtesting, you can demonstrably feel when something is bogging the game down because you're spending too much time fiddling with your cards or moving tokens around, or you have to roll too many dice. There's too many rerolls, and so you can sort of just do it by gut instinct. You're like, this mechanic is literally taking too long.
Mm-hmm.
I spent long in the activation phase. We come up with these things, and they turn, and especially because the game goes across so many different rounds. I mean, you play a lot of rounds of X-Wing. There's a lot of times that you run through the whole planning, activation, combat thing, and sometimes some rounds no shots are fired and that kind of thing. So anything that slows that down is dangerous. And the nice thing is that you can just play the game and you can feel where that hang up happens and you can try to smooth it over. So it's very iterative. It's very much a process. It's very sort of experiential. So that helps a lot when we're trying to address that kind of thing.
Yeah, I've been a hard example of that. There was a card called Enhanced Scopes, which adjusts your pilot skill during the activation phase. And so it reduces your pilot skill to 0, so you go first. But in its original iteration, it was you could choose to be 0 or 12. So you could go first or last. And that sounded really cool. That's a really interesting system, especially with what it had to compete with, advanced sensors and fire control system, et cetera. But anyway, the problem we were running into was it was such a mental strain on the opponent because you could go first or last. And now they're like, okay, well, I have to plan my turn with you potentially going before or after me now. And so it was dragging down the game so immensely. This one card on one ship would make the other person's planning phase take like twice as long. And that's a great example of like, that's literally taking too much time. We can't have that kind of mechanic. You can't cost that correctly for the punishment it's doing to the game.
It just sounds like it stresses someone out so much.
Yeah.
You're just making your game more stressful. Gee, they put real stress tokens. K-Dub Wadsworth, I want to give them a chance to get their question in. We were talking about buffs and nerfs before. What constitutes making a buff? We have seen a few nerfs, but only a few buffs. They're curious why things like Cluster Mines have gotten a buff, yet awful cards like Saboteur have seen no change.
Well, one unfortunate thing is just the reality that, like, there are many cards that are probably not top-tier quality, just sort of by necessity of the way a game with a lot of content is, and buffing them all is not realistic. Because we want to keep the game basically as the cards are printed, except in the most egregious cases.
Yeah, I mean, I can come up with 15 ways to make Saboteur a more interesting, useful card, but the fact that you're changing the way the card's printed on the text, we could just make new cards to the game instead. So.
Oh, man.
Cluster Mines in particular is actually a good example, just in terms of like practicality and that sort of thing. It's easier and healthier to change a rule that doesn't impact printed text than it is to change something that would require a card to be modified. Because when you look at the Cluster Mines card, it's like drop some Cluster Mines, and then you go to a reference card or your rule book to see what Cluster Mines do. So if we change that, it's a lot less impactful than actually changing the text on a card. You don't have to reprint anything. You don't have to remember that the card is different. You just remember, you just have to make sure that you have the most recent rules on hand. So that's cloaking too. We were able to change that. We were able to change the rule rather than the card or any sort of pilots or anything. So there was a much cleaner fix. So whenever possible, if we can just dig into the rules themselves and make a slight tweak there, it's a less impactful edit and it's just smoother. So when we can do that, we like to do that. Doesn't always work. It's not always an option, but when it is, it's the best option.
We are going to. This is a broad question, so I'll just and we're closing in on the end of our hour soon. So I'm going to give Turbo Cooler a shot. What is your design philosophy when it comes to epic ships? Epic ships are, I don't even own any. Are massive ships. They actually aren't the largest ships in the Star Wars universe because you guys keep everything to scale. So these are ships on screen that are generally like larger than X-Wings but smaller than Star Destroyers. Think the very first ship that appears on screen in the first Star Wars, the Tantive 4, the Rebel transports from Empire Strikes Back. The Imperial ones are not in the movies at all, as far as I know.
So are there Corellian Corvettes in this game?
Yeah, the Corellian Corvette.
Yes, there are.
Not the Imperial.
That seems like it'd be really big. Like it'd be like
It's really big.
We do cheat the scale on those. I will point out the small ships are accurate to one another. They all follow the same scale, but the huge ships are like they're like 60% in that scale. They're big
right on the
feel right.
They're sunk a little. Okay.
Too big to play with.
Yeah. So what's your?
We do cheat those a little.
Yeah, I know we only have a few minutes to cover this, and then there's like a few more questions I want to get in. But can you tell us what's fun about designing those, and what do you think works really well about them?
Well, they're interesting. They have such a different set of considerations. One of the fun things is getting to. The first one I worked on was the Sea Rock. I helped Alex and Frank with that a little bit, and did some card pitches for it. And getting to play around with energy is a lot of fun. There's a lot of cool stuff you can do with that. That all of a sudden there's this like internal resource system for these things. That's kind of neat. That's space you can't play in on a normal ship.
Yeah.
So that lets you enable a bunch of cool abilities. You can do things that interact with that. So they're pretty fun from that perspective. I really liked that.
Yeah. The other fun one is you get to have a little more leeway in being a little more simulationist because it's this giant thing, and you spend a lot of money on it because they're big, and you know they have their own separate rule book, and you can kind of give it something that makes it feel that unique character. So like the Imperial Assault Carrier, the Gazanti, is a great example of this because it carries TIE fighters into battle in Rebels. So we were able to do that as a mechanic. So we had to make up new rules about how to deploy ships from other ships and things. But it was really fun to be able to actually be able to simulate that experience you get to see on TV. So that was pretty fun.
And that's one of those things that'd probably be too complicated in the standard game. But in Epic, everyone's sort of agreeing to a more complicated experience. So, it's part of the buy-in. And it's actually a point of appeal there. And that's kind of an interesting thing, too, that, like, this thing that would probably be too annoying in the tournament format is actually awesome in this, this other format.
The last one I want to say is the Imperial Raider is actually a ship we made up. So we wanted a ship that was 150 meters or so for the Empire because they didn't really have anything of that scale. They make these incredibly large Star Destroyers and tiny TIE fighters, and there's not really something of the scale like the Rebels Corvette. So we wanted to make something that was that scale. There were a couple things in the EU at the time that were like roughly the right size, but we didn't really enjoy them that much and everything. And so we wanted to make our own thing. So we basically asked them, can we design this? And they said, well, as long as we like the way it looks, and you come up with a little backstory for it. So we did. And actually, it's going to be its official canon debut, if you will, in Battlefield 2 as the ship that.
2.
Yeah, Battlefront.
Battlefront. Yeah.
Battlefield 2 will be different.
Back in, they're going to have this thing. No. But yeah. So.
But that's cool. I mean, like something that didn't exist at all is now in the Star Wars canon and is going to be in a AAA video game, and that's just fun. It's fun to have been involved in the genesis of that and to be like, oh, we tweaked those guns a little bit and now they look like this, and that's then someone animated that and set a whole story around it. So it's cool to see that happen in the Star Wars universe. It's a little thing, but for someone who grew up with the films and who's always been really excited about it, it's cool. It's a cool geek out moment for all of us, I think.
Yeah. One more chat question, and then I'll begin my rapid fire of my final questions. Tbets94 would like to know who decided on the price for the Jumpmaster.
You can blame me for that. I dropped that ball. Yeah, sometimes you miss. Sometimes you swing and you miss. I like to call that the sort of perfect storm game design problem. Like, a lot of times elements in and of themselves will not be overpowered, but when something all comes together in such a way as the Jumpmaster does, it's got a really good dial. It's got the ability to use ordnance. It's got a pretty good price point. Previous similar ships like the Wild Space Fringer or the Outer Rim Smuggler just didn't see any play at all in the competitive scene. And the Wild Space Fringer's like 30 points and it's got 10 total health and that kind of thing. So it was one of those things where we kept sort of pushing the envelope, and we pushed it too far. So
Yeah,
it happens. You know, we try to get it right, but every once in a while we get it pretty wrong. So
I was actually working on a different game at the time. I was working on Fury of Dracula.
Frank was working on Fury of Francula.
Yeah.
Dracula. So yeah, so I don't know.
Unfortunately, yeah, we had if we had more time, we could have probably.
They
done
couldn't
it.
stop him.
Couldn't stop me.
Just to help Alex and the confused look on his face, the jump master is it's actually literally the ship from The Force Awakens that Rey says, "No, we're gonna go take that ship, not the garbage," and then
No,
it gets
that's the
blown
quad
up.
jumper.
That's the
Quad jumper. I'm sorry.
Easy mistake to make.
They both have jump in it. I'm sorry, I got confused.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm wrong.
The
Ignore
Jump
it.
Master just sounds like a really sick pogo stick.
Yeah,
Like,
we
that's
have
all.
Master 5000 is the full name, and it sounds like a weird 80s, made for TV late night infomercial thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
You know, I sit down with the
I like it a
jump-
lot.
Oh, I feel really embarrassed about getting a ship name wrong on stream, because that leads into my next question. Okay, so I came to this game, and Alex probably followed me onto the stream for similar reasons, because I was walking by the Shut Up and Sit Down booth at GDC back in 2016, where Star Wars Armada, I believe, was on display. It wasn't X-Wing, it was Armada, I remembered later. And I looked down and I said, I could ID half those ships, what their vague purposes in battle, and just by looking at them. And I said, okay, that's interesting. I want to see what else this game is. And I happened to find the X-Wing game before I found the Armada game and got into that. So my design question is, if a ship doesn't have a high profile in Star Wars media, like I think you've dug deep here with this particular wave in particular. Side question,
Yeah.
Are you guys running out of TIE fighters?
Yes.
No, we'll never run out of TIE fighters. Fighters.
So
we haven't gone into that double pod with the wing in the middle yet.
Oh, the
There's-
TIE Experimental?
Yeah, there's the what's the one with the
the full question is, if a ship is not well known, if a ship is not well known in Star Wars media and its role is not for a new player comes in and is like, oh, I've seen A-Wings fly really fast, I've seen X-Wings take down the Death Star, they know sort of how those things work. How do you sort of design for ships that you can't just look at it and know what it does?
Often we go to the source material that it first appeared in as a jumping off point. So sometimes that means reading a short story or a book or something, looking at some comics, whatever it takes to kind of get a sense of how did they show it off? And then if that doesn't give us a lot of guidance, we might say, what does that faction need? That's usually another step. And also just what does it look like it can do? Does this look like a fast ship? Does this look slow? Does it, that kind of thing. So sometimes we use it as a jumping off point to do something wacky and new. Other times we just sort of make what the faction needs.
And then
sometimes we just make stuff up.
Yeah.
Nice.
Also
if it's not here, we can have some free reign, which can be fun.
Nice. And the final question that we will have today, Ulfulvan, there it is. Ulfulvan is very passionate about game design as a career, but they don't want to enter the digital side of things, so they want to get into tabletop and card games. What are your suggestions for breaking into the field for young designers?
I was lucky enough to have an internship that developed into a job, but you can't rely on that by any means. We have a lot of interns. I think it's a nice place to see whether you actually want to do it or not.
Yeah, I think it's worth trying for that reason alone. I did an internship at a different company, and it definitely gave me a good sense of some of the just business realities of the field I would never have seen otherwise. That was oh, okay, I can see this works this way, this works the other way. So there's value in that if you can do it, if you can pull it off.
Yeah, I was classically trained as a chemical engineer, and now I'm a game designer. So sometimes you find out that the actual job you thought you wanted to do isn't really what you want to do. So
I would also just say that, sometimes, especially in this industry, you kind of have to forge your own path. If you like game design and something that's interesting to you, my honest suggestion is to just design a game. It's difficult. You'll learn a lot. You have to carve out time in your schedule for it, and I know that's not always easy. But there's a lot of opportunities out there with Kickstarter. The analog game design world it's booming. We're in this crazy like renaissance of analog gaming, and it's all over Kickstarter. There's all these different independent companies cropping up. So I think more so than ever before, there are fewer gatekeepers, and there are fewer barriers to entry if you can, if you have some hustle and if you have a real yearning to do this kind of thing. Put yourself out there. If you have a good game, there are a lot of avenues for publishing these days that didn't exist before, that didn't even exist when I started 5 years ago. So yeah, I mean, it's an incredibly rapidly expanding industry, and it's kind of just like catch as catch can at this point. I just put your feelers out everywhere, get on social media, talk to people who are in the industry, and just try to get involved in whatever way you can. At the very least, you'll probably learn something.
I'm going to add as a caveat to what Alex is saying two things. First, there's some really great resources for finding out how to figure out how to run a Kickstarter that actually functions financially. You can do a lot of research on that, find out all about it. So if you do go down that path, definitely make sure make sure your numbers work out. Make sure you've negotiated with anyone you're getting manufacturing from beforehand. Make sure you've got your fixed costs under control. All those things. And then the other one
there are
is
definitely.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I just said, yeah, there are definitely. I don't think anyone should mortgage their house or anything, but carry on.
You can do that. That's the thing. I'm not mortgage your house, but you can set up. You can find good resources on what it takes to run a successful Kickstarter and do it. And then the other thing I was just going to say is just keep in mind that it's a business. Keep in mind that we know a couple of freelance game designers. I mean, Jay Little, who designed X-Wing, does a lot of freelance stuff these days. And one of the things about it is, usually when he designs a game, I know that he will sort of have a concept, but he'll go talk it around to people, and he'll have to make a lot of compromises and such because you want the product to exist in addition to being your vision of it. So just understand that and sort of build your plans around it.
Yeah, and as Alex suggested earlier, to make your own game, if you just make an expansion to another game, that's very similar. Because that's in fact what a lot of developers do, is they just make expansions to games. They don't design a new one from scratch. They just sort of take an existing game and work within the confines already specified, which I think takes a different mindset to be able to wrap your head around. How do I make things that don't undermine how the game works, but yet expand it in interesting directions? So sometimes making an expansion to a game might be just as valuable as making a new game, and showing that expansion to a publisher might help, but some people might not like to hear that either. So it really depends on the
Don't
publisher.
sell it.
Don't sell it. This idea that show that you can do the work is helpful.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
And also just apply for jobs.
Yeah.
There's a lot of jobs out there. I didn't have any game design experience before I got my gig, but I had journalism experience, and I had experience as a freelance editor working for Fantasy Flight Games. So you don't necessarily have to have a one-to-one resume. So just put yourself out there, give it a shot. You never know what'll happen.
Well, cool. It's now time, sadly. I would love to just keep asking questions for another 30 minutes to an hour, but all things have value because they must end. That is the nature of life. Thank you all for joining us. This is the Gamasutra Twitch channel where we talk about the art and business of making games. I have been joined by Alex, Max, and Frank. Thank you all for joining us today. Real quick, if they want to ask any more questions for you, like, say, Jindo Fox, if you want to ask this question that you've got in the chat, where can they send it?
That is a great question. If anybody would like to ask me any further questions, you can send emails to adavy@fantasyflightgames.com. I'll be happy to give it a shot. It may collect some dust in my inbox for a while, but I will get to it.
I was going to say, it's not an official Fantasy Flight account, so I won't be able to speak to a lot of things, but I'm on Twitter at Max C. Brook.
Yeah, and I'll answer all your rules questions that you email through the website. So it's about rules. I'll get back to you.
Cool. Yeah, and for everyone who's watching, we would appreciate it if you were to follow the Gamasutra Twitch channel, because even though this is actually our first episode about tabletop games, so thank you all for that, we do talk to a lot of game developers and designers about their upcoming games. If you have an eye, two of the games that I know are in the pipeline, we're going to be talking to the developers of Aven Colony and Pyre in the next couple weeks. So, but that's not next week, that's the week after. So if you're interested in those games, we would appreciate your follow so that we can get you more FaceTime with the people who make the games you love. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
All right.
you.
And with that, everyone, goodbye.
Bye.